Right. Good morning, everybody. Thanks to Keith for that nice introduction. Well done. And thanks to the organisers for inviting me along today. It's a privilege to be here and to speak with you. Let's see if I can get this working. Excellent. Okay. So, fairness, true awareness. Following on from what Martin had to say earlier, I'm hoping to ultimately raise awareness today with you, the audience, and to foster greater communication and dialogue in this ever-evolving space. Substantively, I'll also talk about the other two words as well. But first, let's just get the formalities out of the way. So I do have some funding notification and disclaimer. These are my views. And there's a list of all my affiliations at the bottom. So to tackle this, I'm going to start by looking at fairness through unawareness, okay? And getting specific. What we're meaning when we say fairness through unawareness is we're going to start with a machine learning environment that deliberately excludes sensitive attribute information. And the thinking behind this is that if you're unaware of these protected characteristics, protected in law that is, so that's like age, sex, ethnicity, marital status, religion, disability status, there's a whole list of them that are protected in law, anti-discrimination law, that if we're ignorant of these characteristics, that the decisions that a machine learning algorithm will take will be fair. So, a bit of a leading question, but can I have a show of hands if anybody thinks that sounds reasonable? And if you do think it sounds reasonable, please make a note of my email address at the very end of this presentation, and let's have a discussion, because I'm eager to learn as well. But in a word, no. So, Rachel had mentioned this earlier about proxies, and the example she gave, I believe, was domestic violence being a proxy for gender. So in the world that we live in now, with the amount of data swirling around, we now have a situation where it's evidential that data that we're using in these models is correlated with data about us that describe us. Our characteristics happen to align with sensitive attribute information. And the term that Rachel used, and it is the word used in the industry, is proxies. Okay, so proxies are variables that you are using in your algorithms that are correlated with, to a concerning degree, with sensitive attribute information. Now, so what I'm talking about here is not just a nice to have bit of awareness about this, but this is actually coming through legislation. So I'm going to give a couple of examples. But first, before I do that, I'm going to maybe nail down what I mean by fairness through awareness today. So, we're actively going to use sensitive attribute information with the purpose of trying to detect any bias or discrimination and then to mitigate it, okay? So, rather than being ignorant of sensitive attribute information, we're going to actually face our fears and bring it into the conversation. And this does clash with what we already perceive to be GDPR legislation, customer and individual's privacy, and so forth. However, legislation is beginning to recognize that it's impossible to do the job, if your job is any way towards mitigating against bias and discrimination in the world of AI. It is impossible to do your job if you do not have access to sensitive attribute information on the people that are involved in your AI system. Okay, so really what I want to hammer home today is that fairness through awareness is dead and buried if it was ever alive, and fairness through awareness is the only show in town. And the other buzzword that I want to add is demonstrably. So this is where you have to demonstrate that what you're doing is unbiased. Okay, that what you're doing is not discriminatory against any particular individual or group. Okay, so it's not just talking, and we do a lot of that. Well, we're hoping that where the rubber meets the road, it's going to be demonstrating with evidence. So as I said, I was going to give a couple examples because this isn't just a nice to have, oh yeah, we're unbiased. This is coming in terms of legislation. And I'll get to the EU AI Act because it's a big one for where we are in the world. But some of you might be aware that there's a piece of legislation in New York City coming through next month. No, not next month, where are we now? So July 5th. Is when is the date it begins, it's becoming enacted. And this is a piece of legislation that is going to focus on HR in New York City, and any firm that uses or wants to use AI to help recruit staff, okay, will have to undergo a bias audit by an independent auditor, not by themselves. It won't be self-certification. They will have to undergo a bias audit every 12 months, okay? So the AI tool that you use has to be audited every 12 months, so it has to be updated. And that's been a theme that was mentioned before. Rachel was talking about ongoing bias detection, ongoing involvement between auditors and proprietors of AI systems. So this is specific to New York City, and it's specific to HR. But I thought it's a nice example to show how attempts to operationalize, as Martin said, operationalize AI are underway. So I thought I would lift, I'm going to do a bit of this, I'm going to lift out of the legislative text I have access to. So what I'm presenting on screen here is the operationalization of this particular act. So what they want to do is have an impact ratio, okay? So the independent auditor is going to do this. Now, everybody is aware this is published information that anybody can read, okay? So this is part of the audit. Simply that there's going to be an impact ratio as follows. You're going to have a selection rate, if you're in the world of selection, or a scoring rate if you're scoring candidates, okay? And what you're going to do is you're going to take the selection rate for any particular category, or group, subgroup, and that's going to be divided by the selection rate of the most selected category, okay? And then it's similar for the scoring rate. Let's move into the nitty-gritty example. So you're going to take, say, for example, sex. So we're going to have a binary world here, male, female, okay? So your data might look something like this. And because we can see that the selection rate is greater for men over women, they become the most selected category. And so therefore, the ratio is off the most selected category. So if you were to divide 47 by 48, you would get the 0.979 there, okay? So that's just one characteristic. But we're in the world of multiple characteristics because we're not just defined by one characteristic, we're defined by multiple characteristics. So this is going to be an example of intersectionality between two characteristics. So this is sex and ethnicity. So here now they have got we have an understanding on the sex axis. Now we're going to look at ethnicity. And again, just to guide the eye, the one here is the leading one, so that is white, non-Hispanic or Latino. The selection rate is 52 and everything's off that, okay? And then finally, you have to bring it together. Now this is required in the Act, okay? So you have to publish the individual the sensory attributes, and then you've got to combine them, okay? And then you have to see where it gets thin. And then again, we have one being the most popular, and that's white male. And how that then looks compared to the other groups, okay? And that's it. You only have to publish this. As Rachel was saying before, you don't have to act necessarily in this. You just have to be audited, provide the information. These tables need to be produced and published. And then anybody can see them, okay? So in a way, it's kind of like publicizing how you operate, okay? The AI you're using is selecting and how you're managing that, okay? So there's no action necessarily here. It's just literally, we're using AI. Here are our results. It was audited independently. And there you go, for 12 months. And then it gets updated, okay? So that is fairness through awareness in action. Now on to the AI Act, which has been mentioned, and I'm going to dwell on this for some specifics of it. I know Martin mentioned that it is getting diluted over time, but I also want to say that I applaud the effort that's being made. And I just want to say two things that were in the last. There was a question at the end of Martin's talk about stifling innovation. Two things on that. One is there are regulatory sandboxes baked into the AI Act, which is to allow for innovation, a safe space of innovation where the burden of regulation won't impact immediately. It's primarily aimed at SMEs and startups that may struggle with the regulatory burden, but it's not that it's just a closed shop for those organizations. So that space there is designed for innovation, and this is before you deploy your AI system as a product on the EU marketplace, okay? And the other thing I would say is that with GDPR, which, we could have some scaremongering before 2018, May 2018, I don't believe that GDPR has halted innovation. Yes, I agree that it can stop a conversation in a room, but I do not see the evidence that it has been detrimental to the ability for Europe to innovate. And in that guise, I would like to suggest that AI Act can continue in the same way. And there's a lot of goodwill towards that. So, I'm going to keep this specific to the example of fairness through awareness and moving on from the New York City local law. So, I'm guiding our eyes to Article 10, again, lifted straight out of the Act. And apologies if this is difficult to read, but I'm going to underline the area that refers here. So within Article 10 on data and data governance, and by all means go ahead and get your hands on this Act. It's out there, anybody can access it. So paragraph 5 within Article 10 talks about, to the extent that it's necessary to undertake bias monitoring, okay, detection and correction, it's possible to access special categories of personal data. And there are guardrails in there, okay? But this is saying that if you need to do your job properly, through fairness, through awareness, then this legislation is giving you some support towards that, okay? Now, you may also be interested to know about penalties. So specifically, I've done this because, it goes over to here, but the bottom one here is Article 10, which I just showed you, which includes that paragraph number 5. So this is the upper end of it, and some of you may be aware of this, but basically, if you're non-compliant with the AI Act, then fines could go up to 30 million euro or 6% of global turnover, depending on which is higher, okay? And the two, A and B, is so non-compliance in relation to Article 5. Article 5 is prohibited uses of AI, okay? And then Article 10 is data and data governance, which includes that aspect on bias monitoring, which includes that bit on personal data and accessing personal data. So I want to move on to give you a little bit more about the AI Act and how it interacts with things that might be relevant to people here in the audience. Rachel earlier had a definition of AI, and here's another one for you. And this is what is in the Act as of April 2021. So I'm not going to read everything off here, but what I want to impress upon you is that it's quite broad. People might be saying, yeah, I can see the first one there, A, that makes sense. But when we get down to like C, we're talking about statistical approaches. So essentially, we could be talking about a regression model maybe, linear or logistic, something simple. The point here is that the tech doesn't have to be that sophisticated. It's the area in which you operate in, and I'll have more on that in a moment. I also want to just dwell on the fact that this is probably the most consulted upon piece of legislation in the history of Europe, if not the world. And I think that was said after the recent success when the latest iteration went through the European Parliament. I think Dragos Turovashe actually said that this is the most debated and consulted upon piece of legislation in European history. And that's way after this point that I'm highlighting here, which was to even get to April 2021 when they published the draft legislation. They, in the memorandum, they said how they went about it, and they had these options up for grabs of which way they were going to go. And they opted for, in the end, responding to all the feedback they got, mostly from the private sector, I might add, that they were going to do a horizontal instrument that was going to be proportionate risk-based, so it's going to have risk profiling, and it was going to have codes of conduct which were voluntary for AI that was deemed non-high risk. And that hasn't rendered very well, has it? But, okay, so the pyramid of risk here. So this is the risk profiling. So at the top we have unacceptable risk, and I'll give some examples of that in a moment. And then below high risk, that red box was supposed to be around high risk, so apologies. But this is our voluntary code of conduct here, which includes chatbots before ChatGPT. And then high risk is the most important area for the Act, and I'm going to dwell on that after I give some other points. So special exemptions, there are a few. So military applications are exempt. AI systems to avert a terror threat, and AI systems to search for a missing person. Okay, so these are exempt from the Act. Unacceptable risks. So generalized surveillance of citizens, manipulation of citizens, and social scoring of citizens. Okay, so that's as stated in the Act, and next we'll move on to the high risk. So this is the areas probably of most importance to people in the room to see if you're caught by this. So there were 8 domains in April 2021. So we have critical infrastructure, education and vocational training, safety components, employment And I should say, by the way, that where possible, so this, if you look at the title of this act, it says a harmonization. Harmonization is one of the first words in the title of the act. And so what they were also trying to do with this act was harmonize with existing legislation. And that was to try and appease folks that are already caught by existing EU regs, particularly in like components, the safety components of products and like in medical devices and stuff like that. So when I mention these domains, Annex 2 of the Act is about showing how this harmonizes with existing legislation to put at ease people that feel like this is just way too many regs. So this one here always, I like to dwell on this one, the essential private and public services, because this means credit scoring, which doesn't necessarily come at you when you just look at essential private and public services. But basically, if we're in credit scoring, we could be in the world of banking and insurance. And in any organization that uses credit scoring as part of a model to make a decision on an individual. So that's caught there. We have law enforcement, migration, and border control, and then we have justice, administration of justice, and democratic processes. Okay, so those were the, I say were, the 8 areas of high risk. And now we have ChatGPT. Or more specifically, I should say, we have generative AI and large language models. And so thanks to ChatGPT, and it is brilliant that ChatGPT has come along and it's made us all sit up and take notice. It's, Martin talked about the pause letter, which I think was fantastic from the point of view of raising the profile of this conversation. It needs to be had on so many levels, especially politically, and we need people on the doorsteps, like voters, to have more of an engaged conversation about this. So as a result of the success of ChatGPT and all the foray around it, there's now a 9th dimension to the AI Act, and this is what the recent heckling's been around, is baking in a 9th high-risk area in terms of large language models and the risk that they pose for our ability to have a democracy, misinformation, and poisoning the well of information, basically. So I would say to all of us here to watch this space. But also, I have a note here to say that I should mention this, but it could have been mentioned earlier. In terms of like the conflict between what's going on in the EU and China and the US, I read a story yesterday whereby Google Bard, which is Google's offering in competition with ChatGPT, it's been rolled out in 180 countries, but it hasn't been rolled out in the EU yet. And so this has led to speculation that the reason why Google has not rolled out Bard within the EU yet is because they're worried about existing regulations in the EU and that they'd be caught in a situation where they might end up in court. But the other theory is that, no, they're not worried about that. They're basically withholding the tech from Europe as a reminder to say, this is what happens, guys, when you guys get too heavy-handed with the red tape. Okay, so this is just, I read the story yesterday, so this is ongoing soft power and influence and speculation around what's going on. And people are worried, and this is the type of thing that we're going through right now. So what the people that I'm following at the EU level are doing about this, it's no easy task, and I commend them wholeheartedly for trying to regulate, because, like Martin, I would be in favor of wanting to applaud such a thing. In theory, it is definitely needed, and then in practice, it needs support. So I'll just also mention that with the AI Act, it's part of a suite of legislation. So we've talked about the GDPR regs. There's also the Digital Markets Act, which has actually come into force this month. And that's the Digital Markets one, is regulating e-commerce platforms. And the Digital Service Act, which is due to come into force early next year, is going to regulate social media platforms. And then, last but not least, is the AI Act itself, which the latest that I'm hearing is that it won't be until early 2024 at the earliest. But just like with GDPR, there's going to be a 2-year period of grace. So even when it comes in, everybody's going to be finding their feet. And I'm sure we all know of examples in terms of GDPR where it came in May 2018, and then, okay, everybody was kind of talking about it, and then nothing for a good while. And then it started to creep up and creep up. Now, I know for some people that are working very close to it, they probably were much more aware of it. But for a lot of people that are not hands-on with the data protection stuff, it's like it only seems to be coming forward more and more now with cases that we're hearing in the news. So these things take time to bed in, and there is grace period allowed for people to get their houses in order. So But just on like some of the topics we're touching upon now, within the GDPR that came out in 2018, right of access by the data subject. So I'm just going to focus on one bit of this, which is H, okay? So the existence of an automated decision-making, including profiling, so it's referred to, and that's covering profiling in Article 22. So at least in those cases, you're entitled to meaningful information about the logic involved, as well as significance and the envisaged consequences of such processing of the data subject. Well, I can just tell you that that's basically explainable AI, okay? So what's that calling for as a solution is explainable AI, all right? So it's a real motivation, and that was there in 2018, although it didn't really, rubber didn't really meet the road because we're talking about explainable AI now. Some people might be familiar with that concept of explainable AI, making black box algorithms more transparent, more accountable. But essentially, this piece of legislation is already asking for the data subjects, which is all of us, we're entitled to an explanation if a decision has been taken using AI. But then, there's a new one coming out, and this is going to complement the AI Act, and this is the liability rules for artificial intelligence. In two ways, there's the AI liability directive, and then there's the product liability directive, okay? And basically, what this is following on from GDPR, and basically saying that us data subjects are entitled to access to evidence if we feel we've been discriminated against, and also, and this is kind of scary from an AI provider perspective, the burden of proof is on the AI provider of the system, in terms of causality of hurt, and also proof of burden. Proof of so they have to say if an accusation is made that their algorithm has hurt someone or discriminated against someone, the burden of proof is on the side of the AI provider. So this reg is actually quite supportive to individual citizens in Europe to give them, to strengthen their ability to take an action against an AI provider. So this is where individuals can claim compensation if they have their day in court and can win compensation for being unfairly discriminated against. These rules are going to go alongside with the AI Act. So Keith mentioned that I was in a number of committees. I'm part of the National Standards Authority of Ireland, and I thought I would like to end my talk with a little bit about this side of the business, so to speak. Because we've had a lot of AI, we're now in the AI society and all the rest, as Martin said. And along with the proliferation of AI, there's actually been a proliferation of ISO standards. So I'm just going to mention a few here that have already been published, and you can make a note of them. So, and I guess ISO standards are going to have a role to play in relation to what's perceived as best practice when it comes to things like, so high-risk AI providers in the AI Act will have to undergo a conformity assessment. For the most part, it's going to be self-completion, except for remote biometric identification AI systems. Every other AI high-risk provider will have to self-complete this conformity assessment, which will be deposited in an EU-wide database, and that can be accessed by regulators. So the regulators will react if there's a concern, and they can go and check this database, this repository. So, but when it comes to parts of the conformity assessment, which we don't know the shape of yet entirely, we will lean upon best practice. And that may mean we will lean upon these standards, or standards such as these. And the final two standards I'm going to show were what inspired me to actually join the NSAI. So the top one is actually published already, and this one is not. And I specifically joined NSAI to work on this one. And I'm currently developing an example of bias mitigation to go into the latest draft. And like for all of you out here, anybody feeling like an expert in the room, feel free to reach out to the NSAI. It's not a closed shop. I managed to get in. And it can be quite interesting to see how that world operates. So I've got 1 minute left, but I think that's all I want to say. Yes, there's my email address for anybody that wants to take issue with what I've said today. Thank you.
So, thank you, Adrian. It's great to hear the passion you have for that topic. It's really, really fascinating talk. We've got a few minutes for questions, if anybody wants to ask. I can't actually see.
Hey, Adrian. Yeah, thanks for a very informative talk. Just to your last ISO standard that you're working on there talks about how to detect or eliminate unwanted bias. Who gets to decide what's unwanted bias? And, you know, is it dangerous that there is something making a decision on what's unwanted? One person's unwanted might be another person's, you know, safety net.
So it's a great question, and that standard is still in draft. So definitions can change, but unwanted is basically harmful. To put it another way, and this is going into my example, is that if you have a model whereby, and like focusing on from fairness to awareness, and the focus is on human-centered machine learning and artificial intelligence. If perhaps you have a model whereby you have your feature set and you have your target and you're generating predictions. If you have sensor attribute information that you can feed into that model that basically is considered important, and you can do testing to show us whether it is or it isn't, and also extremely correlated with features already there that are driving those predictions, then that would be what I would say concerning bias that needs looking at, merits further investigation. So it's kind of like the where you have powerful, like, so sensor attribute information being powerful enough to help drive predictions, and whether or not that can be explained by the business operation. And if it can't, then it's something the business would need to look at.
Thanks.
Any more questions over here? Thank you.
Hi, Adrian. Good talk. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
You spoke at length there about compliance with various acts, right? And I was just wondering what your opinion would be on not just compliance, but let's say the competitive advantage opportunity that's there for organizations who are seen, right, to be, for example, publishing that data in line with the ADT Act, or seen to be using AI in a fair way in advance of the compliance, right? That's about kind of avoiding fines and all the rest of it, right? But is there an opportunity there for organizations to embrace this now and start as they mean to go on and gain a competitive advantage or not? That's my question.
So my personal response to that is absolutely. And it would be beneficial in a number of ways to make a start on this sooner rather than later. So not just a nice to have, but basically, yes, stealing a march on being unbiased, demonstrably, as I go back to that word, demonstrably unbiased. But like, probably what I didn't make a bigger sound about was the whole thing about bias and fairness is that it's actually a subset of explainable AI. And you and I both know from our foray around the place that explainable AI may be more pertinent right now for a lot of organizations while we're waiting for the act to be to come into force in Europe. So if you're trying to explain your model, you're halfway towards fairness and bias detection. So there's kind of like a nice complementary situation going on here where explainable AI is like not just in terms of regulation, but in terms of like with the complexity of AI getting as it is, the ability for the C-suite to actually understand what's happening underneath them on their watch is becoming concerning. And different aspects of the business talking to each other, and AI being deployed in different silos within the business, where the business may be. So there might be a core business function that's using AI, but then they're also using it for their own recruitment. And then there's people using it for different reasons. So you might have the marketing department trying to do customer segmentation using AI, but then you might have data scientists trying to also look at more global explanations around how the systems work and how patterns are forming. So there's a degree of pragmatism that's relevant right now. And then if you're already in the space of explainable AI, and I think that everybody is going to have to be, especially in the high risk areas, but there's no real downside to doing explainable AI. And then when you're doing that, it's just one more step to fairness and bias detection.
Thanks. Sorry, just one more thing that strikes me. Just going back to the ADT law, and I know a lot of people in the room are employed probably by American organisations who may well find themselves kind of needing to comply with that law in a few weeks' time. But I guess the important thing perhaps is that you made the point that, yeah, they publish those figures and that chart, right? But if those charts prove the organisation to be biased, then that's going to have significant downstream consequences once those things are published, right? I mean, if it turns out that it's almost exclusively white males that are being hired, obviously that's going to cause a problem. So the consequences for that, yes, they comply, but the consequences downstream, I'm assuming there must be some.
Yeah, and what strikes me about this piece of legislation is how simple it is. You know, like we talked about complexity earlier this morning, about like these things are complex, and yet what I showed you was just a table of counts, you know, and without taking a direct action and specifying you need to do something. Well, you don't. All you need is publish. But you're absolutely right, Fergal, that when they see the results, they'll be like, you know. But that's part of fairness through awareness, and it's about moving the dial. So, and like in Europe, where it'll be, so that legislation is calling for independent auditing. But in the EU AI Act, they've gone for self-completion of the conformity assessment. But that can be called upon by any citizen in Europe. Once it's completed and deposited in the EU-wide database, any concerned citizen can contact the regulator within member states and ask to inspect the conformity assessment because they felt something is amiss. And it could be a journalist, it could be a citizen. So there will be a mechanism for getting at, in Europe as well, of getting at what they said they were doing and compare with what they are doing in practice. So, I mean, like this is a first step, but that will be published, so people need to read it, right? So it should be accessible to everybody. So this is a first attempt. So if those numbers get published, you know, it will be defeated if no one reads them, right? So they have to be read, and people have to know they have access to this information, and therefore they can take action off that. If nobody's noticing it, then companies might feel like, you know.
I think we have time for one more quick question, maybe. Yeah.
Thank you. My question is about the table that you have shown about fairness with visualization. The table that you showed, or the data, is pretty ideal scenario where both a male and female are almost equal. What will be the scenario? Will we call it a fair if the balance is not equal, or for example, for one gender it is less than 10? Similarly, if a model is trained with that, will that be a fair model? Or even if it is predicting, or even it is selecting at the same ratio, so will that be a fair selection, considering that the data was not balanced? And are the matrices that are being utilized, are they fair to handle that scenario? So just what will be the scenario or fairness in that case when it is not the ideal scenario?
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question. And, you know, it makes me think of a couple of things. One is that, as Rachel said earlier, context is key. So in the modeling that I'm doing, to be fair to organizations, if you're talking about recruitment, for example, and you're talking about recruiting, say, engineers, and you're in a territory where the local talent pool is not 50-50, okay? Is that the fault of the employer that's working in that territory? And so, for example, if you have a situation where the talent pool is 80-20 split, men, women, okay, is it fair to ask for a 50-50 in that talent pool, and who goes for the job? And that's not to say that they're off the hook then in terms of like, well, we couldn't achieve balance, okay? So the thing is that to be fair to the company, and what I'm trying to do is that you create a scenario to test that there's not something there that is of concern, like they're not doing anything to make the bias worse, okay? And because like the table I gave, now I didn't come up with those numbers. Those are the numbers in the legislation from New York City. but something else that's coming from the United States, and it's just a guideline. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's the 4/5 rule. That basically, as a guideline, that the least preferred category should be within 4/5 of the most preferred category. Okay, now that's not there in that piece of legislation. But that's not to say that people that look at the data of any company that publishes those numbers and say, well, and if a journalist was to do this and say, well, you're way off the 4/5 rule, so it will force the company to explain the state of play. But that's where they can contact the likes of myself and have a conversation. There's lots of people probably willing to give a helping hand to companies to say whether or not what they're dealing with is they can improve the situation or certainly not disimprove the situation from their perspective, okay? Does that kind of answer your question?
Yes, but you mentioned context. So should we consider in fairness context you mentioned context to the company, but what about the context to the employer or the candidate? So do we need fairness in general, or fairness can be contextual, like as you mentioned to the company?
So it's fairness to the individual and the group that they belong to. Like when you want to put people in categories and groups, so we do have group fairness and we have individual fairness. The fairness is on us citizens, okay? The context is to be fair to the employer, but ultimately that's to do right by them in terms of what they're trying to do and be fair to them in terms of procedure. But always the fairness emphasis is on the individual, and the individual belongs to any protected group. The focus is on them, not on the employee. When I say what I say, is just to make sure that we're assessing the employer in a fair manner. But it's always with the individual or the group in mind for their fairness.
Okay. Thank you. We are going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much, Dr. Adrian.